In 2010, at the height of her career, Beyoncé lost a child, quietly, without cameras, without explanations. No press conference followed. No tears were offered to the public. Instead, she returned to the stage, flawless, while something inside her collapsed. Behind the perfect marriage, the perfect image, and the perfect control, betrayal and grief were rewriting her life in silence. The world applauded a woman who never broke. But what if that strength was the very thing slowly destroying her? The collapse didn't happen on a stage. It happened in 2010, behind a closed door, where no cameras were allowed. Beyoncé lost a child. There was no announcement. No headline prepared the public. The loss was absorbed in silence, then buried beneath rehearsal schedules and studio lights. Within weeks, she was back, performing with the same precision, the same control, the same unbroken image. But something fundamental had shifted. Miscarriage is not just physical loss. It fractures time. It rewrites the future in a single moment. For a woman whose identity had been built on discipline and mastery, the experience carried a brutal message: control has limits. Her body did not obey. Her plans did not survive. And grief arrived without structure, without rules. As the pain settled, another fracture appeared. The marriage the world admired, the one photographed, celebrated, mythologized, was no longer safe. Trust eroded quietly. Infidelity entered the story not as a scandal, but as a psychological rupture. The foundation she relied on collapsed at the exact moment she needed it most. What followed was not chaos. It was containment. She canceled tours. She withdrew from interviews. She stopped explaining herself. For nearly 3 years, Beyoncé spoke less and disappeared more. The silence wasn't accidental, it was strategic. In an industry that demands confession, she refused to turn trauma into content. On stage, the image remained perfect. Off stage, isolation deepened. This is what made the moment so dangerous. There was no public breakdown to release the pressure. No visible collapse to invite help. Only endurance. And endurance, when carried alone, begins to resemble self-erasure. Behind flawless choreography and controlled appearances, grief hardened into restraint. Anger went unspoken. Questions stayed unanswered. The woman praised for being unbreakable was quietly absorbing losses she had never been taught how to process. This wasn't a fall the world could witness. It was a slow internal fracture, one that nearly erased the person behind the image. And in that silence, a choice began to form. Not to explain. Not to apologize. Not to perform pain. But to survive long enough to tell the truth, on her own terms. Long before grief taught her silence, control had already shaped Beyoncé's life. She grew up in Houston, Texas, in a household where potential was recognized early and treated seriously. Talent was not something to be admired from a distance, it was something to be trained, measured, and refined. From the moment her voice stood out, time began to reorganize itself around discipline. By the early 1990s, while other children spent afternoons playing, Beyoncé spent them rehearsing. 4 hours a day. Sometimes 6. Mirrors replaced playgrounds. Repetition replaced rest. Every note had to land precisely. Every step had to hit its mark. Mistakes weren't punished with anger, they were corrected quietly, again and again, until perfection stopped being a goal and became muscle memory. Her father became her manager. That decision altered the balance of the household. Encouragement came with expectation. Protection came with pressure. Love and evaluation began to occupy the same space. The message was never spoken directly, but it was understood: if she worked harder, she would be safe. If she stayed flawless, she would be protected. And then came the losses. Talent competitions were entered, and lost. Auditions ended without callbacks. Stages were exited without trophies. She remembers standing under bright lights, performing flawlessly, and still watching someone else's name being called. The applause belonged to another child. The spotlight moved on. Those moments did something quiet but permanent. They taught her that effort did not guarantee security. They taught her that visibility did not equal safety. And they taught her that failure, even temporary, had consequences. When Destiny's Child began to take shape, the pressure intensified. The group went through multiple lineup changes. Girls came and went. Promises were made and withdrawn. Trust became conditional. Instability entered early. At an age when identity is still fragile, Beyoncé learned to stabilize herself through control. Emotion became something to manage, not express. Vulnerability became something to postpone, not explore. The household was structured, not chaotic. But structure, when unyielding, teaches a dangerous lesson: that safety must be earned, and can be revoked. As success drew closer, standards rose higher. Discipline hardened into expectation. Expectation hardened into identity. Rest felt like risk. Slowing down felt irresponsible. By the time Destiny's Child secured a record deal in 1998, Beyoncé was just 16 years old, already carrying adult responsibility, adult pressure, and an adult fear of falling behind. There was no space to unravel. No language for doubt. No permission to be unsure. She learned to lead without complaining. To absorb disappointment without reacting. To perform certainty even when it wasn't felt. Control became survival. If she controlled her voice, no one could silence her. If she controlled her body, no one could reject her. If she controlled her image, no one could abandon her. That belief followed her into adulthood. It shaped how she handled criticism, how she navigated fame, how she managed pain. And years later, when her body failed to carry a child, when grief arrived without warning or structure, that same instinct returned. Contain it. Control it. Say nothing. What protected her as a child became the reason she endured loss alone as an adult. Because when control is the only language you learn, asking for help feels like weakness. She didn't grow up learning how to fall. She grew up learning how to hold herself together. Quietly. Precisely. At any cost. And one day, holding it together would no longer be enough. Beyoncé did not enter the music industry gradually. She was pulled into it before she had time to understand what it would demand in return. By the time Destiny's Child secured its record deal in 1998, she was 16 years old, an age when most people are still testing boundaries, making mistakes, and learning who they are allowed to become. Beyoncé was already being asked to represent something larger than herself. The transition from rehearsals to reality was immediate and unforgiving. Recording sessions stretched late into the night. Promotional appearances filled the calendar. Choreography, vocals, image, everything was expected to align. There was no adjustment period. The industry did not wait for her to grow into the role. It assumed she already had. And in many ways, she did. Years of discipline had prepared her to perform under pressure. She knew how to deliver consistency. She knew how to absorb criticism without reacting. She knew how to stand still when others faltered. What she did not know was how to fail safely. As Destiny's Child began releasing music, instability followed closely behind success. The group went through multiple lineup changes, each one handled quietly, professionally, without public conflict, but not without emotional cost. Relationships fractured. Trust was tested. And Beyoncé, positioned at the center, learned another lesson early. Leadership often means silence. She did not explain the changes. She did not defend herself. She moved forward. By 1999, the group had broken into the mainstream. Hits climbed the charts. Tours expanded internationally. The pace accelerated, and never slowed down. Schedules became relentless. Privacy disappeared. Every appearance was monitored. At an age when exhaustion should have signaled a need to stop, Beyoncé learned to push harder. Fatigue was reframed as commitment. Emotional distance was reframed as professionalism. And the world rewarded it. Awards arrived early. Applause followed consistently. The image of composure began to harden into expectation. Beyoncé was no longer seen as a teenager navigating pressure, she was seen as someone who could handle anything. That perception would follow her for years. When she transitioned into a solo career in the early 2000s, the pressure intensified rather than eased. Success was no longer shared. Responsibility no longer divided. Every decision, every risk, every failure would now carry her name alone. The first solo milestones came quickly. Chart success. Critical praise. Industry validation. But so did the isolation. Without the structure of a group, there was no buffer. No place to hide vulnerability. No shared weight. The margin for error narrowed further. And so she refined what had always kept her safe. Control. She controlled rehearsals. She controlled performances. She controlled access. Interviews became rare. Explanations became unnecessary. Silence became policy. The more the public demanded intimacy, the more Beyoncé retreated behind precision. The image grew sharper, more polished, more distant. Strength became her defining trait, not because she chose it, but because the world expected it. By her early 20s, she had already internalized a dangerous belief. If I slow down, I fall behind. If I show weakness, I lose control. If I stop performing, I disappear. Success had arrived too early to question those assumptions. There had been no time to test them. No space to challenge them. And so Beyoncé kept moving. Forward. Upward. Without pause. What no one noticed was that speed can be a form of avoidance. And the faster she ran, the less opportunity there was to confront what she carried beneath the surface. The industry saw an artist ascending. The public saw a star solidifying her place. But inside, something quieter was forming. A life built on momentum has no room for collapse. And when collapse eventually comes, it doesn't announce itself. It waits. By the mid-2000s, Beyoncé was no longer rising. She had arrived. Her solo career accelerated with a precision few artists ever experience. Albums didn't just perform well, they dominated. Tours didn't just sell tickets, they filled arenas across continents. Awards accumulated faster than they could be processed. By 2004, she had already won 5 Grammy Awards in a single night, a record at the time for a female artist. The industry crowned her an icon before she turned 23. And icons are not allowed to hesitate. Every appearance became symbolic. Every performance was treated as proof of talent, of discipline, of inevitability. Beyoncé was no longer just an artist making music. She was a standard against which others were measured. That kind of visibility comes with a price. Perfection was no longer impressive. It was expected. Mistakes were no longer tolerated. They were magnified. So Beyoncé responded the only way she knew how. She tightened control. Rehearsals became surgical. Movements were broken down to seconds, angles, breath. Nothing was left to chance. If she walked onto a stage, it was because every variable had already been calculated. On camera, she was composed. In public, she was reserved. In interviews, she revealed almost nothing. Silence wasn't mystery, it was protection. By 2008, when she married, the image solidified even further. The world embraced the idea of a perfect union, 2 powerful figures, aligned, unshakable. The narrative was clean, aspirational, almost untouchable. And Beyoncé let it stand. Not because it was false, but because it was controlled. Behind the scenes, the pace remained brutal. Tours stretched for months. Sleep was fragmented. Life became modular, broken into rehearsals, flights, performances, recovery, repeat. There was no space left unplanned. In moments of stillness, anxiety surfaced. So she eliminated stillness. Movement became safety. The more flawless the image became, the narrower the margin for vulnerability grew. Beyoncé wasn't just protecting her career anymore, she was protecting the structure of her life. Strength had become her currency. Control had become her language. The world interpreted her restraint as confidence, as invincibility. But invincibility is an illusion sustained through effort. By her late 20s, she had built a life where everything depended on her ability to hold it together. Any visible crack would ripple outward, into the brand, the marriage, the legacy. So she learned to compartmentalize. Joy stayed on stage. Fear stayed hidden. Pain stayed private. This era produced some of her most celebrated performances, the kind that looked effortless precisely because of how much effort they required. Each show reinforced the same belief: she was unbreakable. What no one could see was the cost of sustaining that belief. Because perfection is not neutral. It demands constant maintenance. And maintenance, when uninterrupted for years, becomes exhaustion. By 2010, after more than a decade of relentless momentum, Beyoncé did something almost unheard of at her level. She stopped. Tours were cancelled. Appearances became rare. Schedules were cleared. To the public, it looked like a pause. To Beyoncé, it was survival. Something had reached its limit. The icon era had created an image powerful enough to impress the world, but too rigid to absorb shock. And shock was coming from a place she couldn't rehearse for. The collapse that followed would not be public. It would not be dramatic. It would not fit the image she had built. It would happen quietly. And when it did, the very traits that made her legendary, control, silence, endurance, would nearly erase her. The collapse did not arrive with scandal. It arrived with absence. In 2010, after more than a decade of uninterrupted momentum, Beyoncé stepped away from the machine she had helped build. Tours were cancelled. Public appearances vanished. Interviews stopped. For the first time since her teenage years, the calendar went quiet. Officially, it was called a break. Privately, it was something else entirely. That year, Beyoncé suffered a miscarriage. The loss was not announced when it happened. It was not explained. There were no prepared statements, no carefully worded press releases. The world continued to see flawless performances, unaware that the future she had imagined had ended without warning. Miscarriage does not end loudly. It ends plans. For someone whose life had been built on precision and anticipation, rehearsals scheduled months ahead, tours mapped down to the minute, the loss dismantled her sense of control at its core. Her body had failed to follow the script. No amount of discipline could reverse it. She later described the moment in simple terms: empty. An emptiness no choreography could fill. And she did what she had always done in moments of danger. She contained it. Grief was folded inward. Pain was managed privately. Silence returned as a familiar defense. To the public, she remained composed. To herself, she was unraveling in ways she had never experienced before. At the same time, another fracture widened. The marriage the world admired, the image of stability, loyalty, symmetry, was under strain. Infidelity entered the relationship not as a headline, but as a destabilizing force. Trust eroded quietly. Conversations became guarded. Certainty dissolved. This convergence was devastating. Loss followed by betrayal. Grief followed by instability. And there was nowhere to place it. Beyoncé had been praised for strength her entire life. Now that praise became a burden. Strength meant endurance. Endurance meant silence. Silence meant isolation. There was no space to admit confusion. No permission to express anger. No model for what breaking safely looked like. So she kept performing when she could, and disappearing when she couldn't. Between 2010 and 2013, her presence became sporadic. Projects slowed. Access narrowed. She retreated behind the boundaries she controlled most effectively: privacy and silence. To the industry, it looked like discipline. To fans, it looked like mystery. To Beyoncé, it was survival. But survival through containment has consequences. The pressure did not release, it condensed. Grief hardened into restraint. Anger went unspoken. Questions circled without answers. Who am I if my body betrays me? Who am I if my marriage fractures? Who am I when perfection no longer protects me? These were not questions she could ask publicly. They were not questions she knew how to answer privately. What made this period so dangerous was its invisibility. There was no public collapse to signal distress. No crisis visible enough to invite interruption. Only excellence continuing on the surface, while identity fractured underneath. The world saw an icon taking a break. Beyoncé was facing the limits of the life she had built. Control had carried her through childhood. Silence had carried her through fame. But now, both were failing. And somewhere inside that quiet, suffocating restraint, a realization began to form, slowly, painfully, undeniably. If she continued this way, she would survive the image, but lose herself. What followed was not recovery. It was erosion. When control fails once, it doesn't simply return. It weakens. It hesitates. And for Beyoncé, hesitation was unfamiliar territory. She had been trained to move forward, not inward. To fix, not to sit with what couldn't be fixed. Grief does not ask for permission. It waits. In the months after the miscarriage, anger began to surface, not loudly, not destructively, but internally. Anger at the betrayal of her body. Anger at the fracture inside her marriage. Anger at herself for believing that discipline could protect everything she loved. But anger had nowhere to go. She could not scream. She could not explain. She could not fall apart publicly. So the anger turned inward. This is where the collapse became most dangerous. Not because of scandal, but because of identity. For the first time in her life, Beyoncé faced a version of herself that did not function through excellence. The strategies that had carried her through childhood and fame, control, silence, endurance, no longer produced stability. They only prolonged the pressure. And pressure, when unrelieved, distorts perception. She began to question the foundation of her identity. If I am not performing, do I still exist? If I am not perfect, am I still valuable? If I speak, what do I lose? These questions did not arrive all at once. They circled slowly, persistently, during long stretches of isolation. Studios went quiet. Appearances became rare. Time, once measured in rehearsals and flights, stretched uncomfortably wide. Stillness exposed what motion had concealed. Between 2011 and 2013, Beyoncé existed in a kind of controlled disappearance. She was present enough to remain visible, but absent enough to protect herself from scrutiny. Projects were delayed. Access tightened. Silence deepened. To the outside world, it looked intentional. To Beyoncé, it felt unstable. She was neither fully retreating nor fully returning. Neither collapsing nor recovering. She was suspended. And in that suspension, a frightening realization emerged. If she continued to contain everything, the image would survive, but the person would not. This was the closest she came to erasure. Not disappearance from fame, but disappearance from herself. Because when pain is never expressed, it doesn't disappear. It reshapes identity around avoidance. It teaches you to live smaller inside your own life. Beyoncé recognized this pattern instinctively. She had seen it before, in childhood, in the early days of pressure, in the way control had replaced vulnerability. But now the stakes were higher. The losses were heavier. The silence was no longer protective. It was corrosive. Something had to change. Not publicly. Not performatively. But fundamentally. The shift did not begin with forgiveness. It did not begin with answers. It began with permission. Permission to feel anger without immediately resolving it. Permission to acknowledge grief without disguising it. Permission to stop protecting an image at the cost of her own survival. This was not a triumphant decision. It was a necessary one. She did not decide to speak yet. But she decided not to disappear. And that distinction mattered. Because for the first time, Beyoncé began to imagine a version of herself that could hold contradiction, strength and pain, control and vulnerability, silence and truth. The collapse had stripped away certainty. But it had also created space. Space for something new to take shape. Not a return to perfection. Not a restoration of the old image. But the beginning of a different kind of power, one that would not rely on silence to survive. That power had not found its language yet. But it was forming. Quietly. The danger was no longer the pain itself. It was what the pain was turning her into. By 2013, Beyoncé had mastered disappearance without vanishing. She remained visible enough to satisfy expectation, yet distant enough to avoid exposure. The world saw restraint. Inside, restraint was becoming confinement. Control had once given her safety. Now it was narrowing her life. She noticed it in small, unsettling ways. Decisions took longer. Trust came slower. Joy felt muted. Even success, when it arrived, no longer landed with the weight it once did. Applause sounded familiar, but distant, like noise heard through a wall. This was not depression in the way people expect it to look. There were no public breakdowns. No visible unraveling. It was something colder. A gradual detachment from parts of herself that once felt alive. She had built a life where everything depended on composure. Where anger had to be productive or hidden. Where grief had to be managed efficiently. Where questions had to wait. And the questions were waiting. What if silence is no longer strength? What if control is no longer protection? What if surviving the image means losing the self? These questions didn't demand immediate answers. They demanded honesty. For the first time, Beyoncé began to consider that the life she had perfected might not be capable of holding her truth. That the structure she relied on, discipline, privacy, endurance, had limits when faced with grief and betrayal. This was not a moment of collapse. It was a moment of clarity. She understood something fundamental, continuing as she was would preserve the brand, but not the person. And preservation without presence is a slow disappearance. That realization carried fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of judgment. Fear of being misunderstood. But it also carried something unfamiliar. Relief. Relief at the possibility that she did not have to contain everything anymore. That silence did not have to be permanent. That strength did not have to mean isolation. The shift was internal, almost invisible. There were no announcements, no declarations. But her relationship to pain began to change. Instead of sealing it away, she started observing it. Sitting with it. Letting it exist without immediate correction. That was new. For someone trained to fix, not feel, it was terrifying. And necessary. This was the true turning point, not the moment she spoke, but the moment she decided she would. Someday. In a form that could hold complexity without explanation. In a language that did not require permission. Art began to re-enter the process, not as performance, but as a container. Images. Words. Symbols. She did not intend to tell her story yet. She intended to survive long enough to tell it well. The collapse had taken her to the edge of erasure. But it had also forced a choice. Remain silent forever, and disappear inside the image. Or transform the silence into something that could finally speak. She chose the second path. Quietly. Deliberately. And from that decision, something unprecedented would emerge. Beyoncé did not break her silence with words. She broke it with structure. By 2015, something had shifted beneath the surface. The pain that once demanded containment now demanded form. Not confession. Not explanation. Form. A way to hold contradiction without flattening it. A way to speak without pleading to be understood. That form became Lemonade. Released in 2016 as a 60-minute visual album, Lemonade was not a return to the spotlight. It was a controlled exposure. Every frame was deliberate. Every lyric measured. Every pause intentional. The project did not ask for sympathy. It refused it. This was not an album about betrayal alone. It was about what betrayal does to identity. The work moved through stages: denial, anger, grief, forgiveness, reclamation, not as a linear recovery, but as a psychological map. Pain was not resolved neatly. It was examined, held, turned over until it revealed shape. The imagery mattered. Water, fire, dark rooms, open fields. These were not metaphors chosen for aesthetics. They were containers for emotions that could not be safely spoken. Rage existed without apology. Vulnerability existed without collapse. Forgiveness appeared, but it was not celebrated. It was considered. For the first time, Beyoncé allowed anger to remain visible. Not explosive anger. Controlled anger. The kind that does not ask permission. The kind that refuses to be softened for comfort. She did not narrate the story. She structured it. By refusing interviews, she refused reduction. There would be no sound bites to simplify grief. No quotes to domesticate pain. The audience was not invited to judge her choices. They were invited to witness complexity. This mattered. Because for years, Beyoncé had survived by compressing emotion into silence. Lemonade reversed that process. It expanded emotion into art, large enough to hold contradictions without resolving them. Strength existed alongside hurt. Love existed alongside anger. Control existed alongside vulnerability. None of these canceled the other. The project landed with force precisely because it did not explain itself. It trusted the audience to sit with discomfort. To recognize the emotional truth without needing explicit confirmation. In doing so, Beyoncé reclaimed something she had lost. Authorship. She was no longer responding to narrative. She was constructing it. The betrayal that once destabilized her identity was no longer hidden or managed. It was contextualized. Given shape. Transformed into language that could not be interrupted. This was not therapy made public. It was survival translated into form. The impact was immediate and lasting. Lemonade was praised not just as music, but as cultural articulation. It reframed conversations about marriage, womanhood, anger, and resilience, without positioning Beyoncé as victim or hero. She did not ask to be understood. She demonstrated understanding. And in that demonstration, power shifted. Power was no longer defined by perfection. It was defined by agency. By choosing when to speak, how to speak, and what to withhold. The silence that once protected her had nearly erased her. The art that replaced it allowed her to exist fully, without fragmentation. This was not a return to who she had been. It was a refusal to go back. From this point forward, Beyoncé would no longer survive by containment. She would survive by authorship. And that distinction changed everything. After Lemonade, Beyoncé no longer needed to prove resilience. She practiced it. The shift was subtle but irreversible. She appeared less often, but with greater intention. Each project carried weight, not volume. Visibility became selective. Silence, once defensive, became deliberate. Power had changed form. In 2018, she stepped onto the Coachella stage as the first Black woman to headline the festival. The performance was not nostalgia. It was architecture. Every movement, every reference, every formation carried historical weight. Black culture was not decoration, it was foundation. The message was clear, authorship was now complete. Motherhood deepened that clarity. It did not soften her ambition, it refined it. Time became more precious. Purpose replaced momentum. Legacy replaced validation. She began choosing projects that reflected continuity rather than reaction. Black is King was not a response, it was a statement of presence, lineage, and continuity. It rejected spectacle in favor of symbolism. It spoke in images that did not require translation. Beyoncé was no longer negotiating space. She was defining it. What made this era distinct was restraint. She did not explain her choices. She did not participate in constant discourse. The absence of commentary was not evasion, it was confidence. Power, at this stage, was quiet. It did not interrupt. It did not defend. It did not chase relevance. It waited. And when it appeared, it did so fully formed. Her work began to function less as entertainment and more as positioning, cultural, emotional, historical. She did not need to center herself as the subject of pain anymore. She centered meaning. The audience was trusted to meet the work where it stood. This was the inverse of her early career, when perfection was demanded and silence was survival. Now, silence was sovereignty. Control was no longer fear-driven. It was choice. She had learned something essential through collapse. Strength that relies on endurance alone will eventually break. Strength that allows truth to exist becomes sustainable. By refusing constant access, Beyoncé reclaimed presence. By refusing explanation, she preserved complexity. By refusing perfection, she achieved authority. Legacy, in this form, was not built through dominance. It was built through coherence. The child who learned to survive through control had become a woman who understood when to release it. The icon who once feared stillness had learned to inhabit it. This was not reinvention. It was integration. Pain was no longer sealed away. It was contextualized. Silence was no longer a cage. It was a boundary. And within that boundary, Beyoncé existed fully, not as image, not as armor, but as authorship realized. Beyoncé's story is not defined by fame, awards, or flawless performances. It is defined by what happened when control stopped working. For years, strength meant silence. Endurance meant survival. And perfection meant safety. But loss taught her something discipline never could, that control has limits, and silence has a cost. She did not survive by becoming louder. She survived by becoming truer. The collapse did not erase her. It forced a reckoning, with grief that could not be managed, anger that could not be hidden, and a self that could no longer exist only as an image. What emerged was not a softer version of strength, but a more honest one. Her journey reminds us that resilience is not the ability to endure endlessly. It is the willingness to change before endurance turns into disappearance. Most people do not break because they are weak. They break because they hold too much for too long, in silence, believing that letting go means losing everything. Beyoncé chose something else. She chose authorship over approval, truth over perfection, boundaries over exposure. And in doing so, she showed that power does not require constant visibility. That healing does not require explanation. That survival does not always look like triumph, it often looks like choosing to stay present in your own life. Her story leaves a quiet question behind, one that has nothing to do with celebrity. What part of yourself have you been containing just to survive? And what might happen if you allowed it to exist, without apology? Because strength is not what you hide. It is what you learn to carry honestly. So what's your story?